So now that we have our model in Maya, we've got to look at how we can light it and render it for illustration. Now, this will change depending on your particular needs, but we can stick to the conventions, but there are different approaches. So right now, in any of these windows, you can see these things are lit by what we call the default light in Maya. It's sort of coming from almost straight on. It might be slightly upper left light. It's kind of hard to tell because there are no shadows being cast or anything like that. So we have to set up our own lights, and to do that here in Maya. So to do this, we want to actually add lights to our scene. So in Maya, if we go to create lights, and we'll just use a point light because it's the simplest one to move around. And we can go into our perspective view here. And to see the effects of the light, just like you did before in your previous assignments, you hit 7 on the keyboard. Right? And so remember, we want to light this from the upper left, but that's going to change depending on what view we're using. So if we look at this in the top view, you'll notice that it's not being lit because the lighting conditions are independent for each view. Not the position of the light, but whether you see the light. So if I hit 7 in this view, then we'll see the lighting here. So if we want to do this in the upper left, we can move it up here to the what looks like the upper left. But if we look at it here in the front view, it's still quite low. So we can raise it up until we have this. Now we're just considering the top view right now. We want to give most of it in, have most of it in light and some of it in core shadow here. So that's pretty good, showing us the form of the teeth. But we need another light down here to fill in some of the core shadows. And there are lots of different ways to do this, but probably the simplest thing to do is to select this light and go to Edit and Duplicate. Then we're going to move this down to the lower right. Again, if we look in the front view, it's to the right, but it's too far up. Now, everything is a little bit flatly lit now. It's being equally lit from the lower right and from the upper left. So we want to change the intensity of the lower right light. So to do that, we select this light, then over here in the channel box, we'll see point light 2, point light shape 2, and down here it says intensity, and we can reduce this to a value of, we can try 0.5 or we can try 0.4. So we don't want this to be too bright. If it's too flatly lit from both directions, then we won't see much of the form. So we can do a test render of this, and to see what area of the screen will render, we can press this button here. It frames our shot depending on the resolution of our image. So once we've done that, we may change this, but right now it's at a default setting. We can go up here and press the clapboard with the eye, and then press the render button here. And so we'll render it out in the way that it's lit. Now, you'll want to make sure that the renderer listed here is Maya software. There are other renderers you can use in here, but it's not actually the best renderer, but it will work on every machine that you work on. So we can do it that way. I'm going to reduce the intensity of this light a little bit and render this again. So we just want to have most of the light coming from the upper left so we can have some core shadow, but not going to pure blackness. And we can move this light position around too. Maybe it's a little too high. Oops. And we can render this again. Okay, so that's pretty good. It shows us some light regions here. We can see going into core shadow, some of these areas. It gets a little dark here because there's no light coming from here. So if you're illustrating this, you might want to modify that a little bit, not go perfectly black. You could add more lights in the scene, but it may start to confuse matters a little bit. But this isn't really rendering at the right size for us. So the next thing we want to do is go into the render settings here. So it's the clapboard with the little cog wheel beside it. And under the common tab, just scroll down and go to the image size presets. And right now we're doing half HD, so typical HD format, but at half the resolution. For print, we may want to render out something more like letter size paper. Now this will take longer to render and it'll be higher resolution, but it'd be more useful for a drawing reference. That's the only thing we really have to change here. Now we should also, under the custom tab, or beside the custom tab, we'll see my software tab. The quality here we can set to production quality. And then we can adjust our camera just by zooming in or out so it fills up more of the screen. Now you'll see that this area that's in light gray is not renderable. It's only the area inside these bounds, but we don't see the top and bottom bounds. In order to see that, we have to go to View, Camera Settings, and go to Overscan. And you should just see the top and bottom. If you want to see it more clearly, you can go to View, Camera Settings, and I think vertical? Yeah, vertical. And that will give you a better idea, and you can zoom in a little bit more. So now if we click on render, this will take longer to render because it's a much higher resolution image. So that took 20 seconds to do it, and this machine I have is probably a little more powerful than the one you're using, so don't be surprised if it takes a little while, but that's okay. Now one thing we may want to do actually is if we select this model, and I didn't think of this before, but go into the attribute editor, go back to the Fong tab. Remember we were working with the specularity? Reflectivity is at 0.5, and it shouldn't matter, but you might want to turn that down to 0, just in case we're getting reflections in the surface of this, and they take quite a while to calculate. So once you've rendered this out, you can go to File, Save Image, and I recommend saving this as a TIFF. And I'll just put this on my desktop, and we'll call this Mandible Superior View. So if we want to render out different views of this, we can do it in two different ways. One way is sort of simpler conceptually, but takes a little more work, I guess. And that is to render from these different cameras. So if we want to render a front view now, we can turn on the resolution gate again, go to View, Camera Settings, Vertical. But now you'll notice that the lights are in the wrong position because this is lit from the upper left for the top view. So we'd have to go in and move the lights around to make it what we would need for the front view render. So something more like this, and we can check it out in here, and we can zoom in. Now we want our renders from the front and side to be about the same size. We can fix them up in Photoshop later, but it'd be better if we could do it here. So again, this should take about 20 seconds or so to render. Sometimes it shows you bit by bit as it does it. Other times it will just show nothing like this, the big blue screen, and then suddenly it's done. So you can see we're getting actually our darkest core shadow down here, the upper left-hand light. So we might want to play around with this a little bit. Maybe pull our light out from the upper left here. Maybe bring it out front a little bit. Then our lower right light could maybe be a bit lower. So it's important, we're not trying to get rid of the shadows, we're just trying to soften them up so they don't go into pure blackness here. So we'll just try this render again. So this is a little different than your previous assignments. You've got to make some decisions about how to light this, knowing our conventions of upper left light, knowing that we want some reflected light coming from the lower right to soften those shadows a bit. So you'll have to do this on your own if you're doing one of these types of illustrations for your third assignment. So that I think is better. So we're getting softer core shadow under here, but core shadow here, core shadow back here, core shadow here. Now it's maybe a little bit light. I'm going to save this anyway. Again as a TIFF. And this would be mandible anterior view. The window's expanded here a little bit. So we could continue to play around with this to get the lighting the way that we want. Maybe going down here a little bit lower to darken up these core shadows a bit, and we can also reduce the intensity of this light. This is looking at that light through the attribute editor rather than the channel box, but the same value is listed in both places. Let me just render this one more time. Should be done just now. Here it goes. Boink. Actually, that to me is a little bit better. So we're getting more of this surface deformation revealed, some of the subtleties down here, a bit of a darker core shadow in here and here, and some of these subtleties here. And so we're getting some halftone region in here, things like that. Could do with a little more halftone. We're getting core shadow going into halftone here. So I'm going to save this one. It's going to overwrite this one. But anyway, you can continue to work with this, trying to figure out the best way to light it. So, you know, I might actually want to move it a little closer to the object. And so what's happening when I do move it in towards the object from the upper left, it's giving us some more halftone region in here. So we're getting a wider range. So we're getting highlight here, core shadow going into halftone, and there's a lot more halftone region here. Actually, this is much better because what we're seeing is a lot of surface detail that's revealed because it's not just bathed in light. Some of the light is raking over the surface, and we get halftone going to core shadow, halftone, core shadow, going down to halftone, core shadow, and then some reflected light coming up under here. So this is actually the best view by far. So I'm actually going to save this file. That's the other thing, save your scene as you go along because things will crash. And so we could render this one out. And then we could repeat all of these steps for the side view, depending on which views you need. Now you may say, well, actually, this is a side view, but I want to draw the outside of it rather than the lingual, the tongue side of this. So depending on what you have. So you can do that by going to Panels, Orthographic, and right now we're in the side view. We can go to New and choose either right or left. I'm not sure. I think we're looking from the left view now. If we go to right. Nope, that was the right view. So we'd want to go to the left view. So now we can see it from the left, and we can go through the same steps of changing the lighting from the upper left, adding some lower right lighting to fill it in. And again, you want to work with this until, see, if I bathe it in light like this, so I pull the light out, it's hard to see a lot of the surface detail. Now we don't want it to be too dark, but by pulling the light in towards it a little bit, then we get a lot more halftone. So we get some light struck, but then we get this subtle variation that reveals all these small details that are better for drawing and revealing form. And we can move the lower right hand light just to add some fill into the core shadows. That's not bad. Maybe lower down. And we don't want to just blank out the core shadows by pulling it too much out front. You can see my intensity is actually quite low now. So you have to work with this to do what you want. So maybe something like this. So we get core shadow, but it's being lit up a little bit by this reflected light. And then we can do the same thing. And we can render this out. Now the last thing we want to do, actually before you do the rendering, is create a little box that we can use for scale, right? So if we create a cube, if we go to create polygon primitives cube, it will be right in the middle of our scene. Now you can see that this thing doesn't seem to be to scale because this is a 1 centimeter cube. So this has come in at a very large scale. It's probably 10 times actual size, I think. It's kind of hard to say. I don't know what the scale for this thing is. We could probably find this in the Morphosource site, but we can bring this into the scene, and it's probably useful to put a black shader on this. So if you just right click and go to assign new material, Maya surface shader, and we'll just have a black shader on it, and we can just look at it so it's placed somewhere in all of our views that we can see it. It's just an easy thing to scale in Photoshop if we want to make sure that our different views are at the same scale. So I've scaled this up 10 times actually. So I selected the cube and went to the channel box and just put 10 in scale XYZ. But that's just as a reference object, so I know how big that is. So we can just make sure that it's consistent between all of the views. So you can render out all of these views and use that to illustrate. If you needed a different, more abstract view, you could do it from this camera and lighting it from here, doing all the same steps. But it's probably better to do these orthographic views and changing the lighting as you go.